Thank you for coming to Ignite. Thank you for coming to my session. And let me introduce myself. My name is Jeff Fritz. I am a program manager on the Microsoft Web Platform ASP.NET team, the Azure Development Experience. We build cool web stuff for you to use, okay? And this is Introduction to ASP.NET 5, all right? This is the new ASP.NET that we are still working on. We're going to talk about how it's being built out there in the open for everybody to see and start engaging with. So before I get into ASP.NET 5, let's talk about how .NET has changed now in 2015, right? 15 years after we launched. We've had all these different verticals of .NET frameworks, right? You can build for the Windows desktop or the store or the phone, right? ASP.NET 4 and the previous ASP.NET runtimes were out there with this app model and a giant framework, right? And a runtime that sat on top of that. But the new ASP.NET 5, look at how small that is comparatively to the others. This is to relative scale. We've got a very thin app model and a small framework on top of a very thin runtime. Okay? We've got some options there because now we've got two flavors of the .NET framework. We've got .NET Framework 4.6, which is the .NET framework that we know and love that comes with Visual Studio, runs on our desktop, and will run WinForms, WPF, ASP.NET, all that good stuff, and it runs on Windows. The new one, the exciting one, that you, as people who are interested in ASP.NET 5, want to learn more about is .NET Core. And .NET Core, we're promising, is going to run on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS X. Okay? Now, between these two frameworks, there is a common runtime, there is a common Roslyn compiler, and you're going to install the components and pieces of the framework using NuGet. Okay? Everybody familiar with NuGet? Yes? NuGet's my product, so I want to see lots of nodding heads. Okay, I'm seeing most of the room nod. That's called a plug there. See what I did? So what is .NET Core? .NET Core is this unified base class library that we have there in the middle in blue. And sitting on top of that are our application models. And right now, we're going to push ASP.NET 5. We're going to do universal window apps on top of that. And any other app model that we decide fits here, we're going to add on to the right. You have this runtime adaptation layer that will adapt appropriately for your OS and framework that you need to use with those runtimes, those native runtimes down on the bottom. NuGet is completely mainstream. All of those things in the previous, they're all packages that you will install and you'll be able to run in parallel with .NET Core. Now, I'm using in parallel poorly there. You'll be able to deploy your own version, your own specific set of .NET Framework components that will live side by side with other frameworks and other applications on your systems. So think about it. Maybe you were deploying .NET 4.5 to a server, and then you had .NET 4.5.1 come along, and you're not sure if you want to do the update, apply those changes because, well, 4.5 is out there, and you don't want to break an application over here because you're putting down 4.5.1 for an application over there that runs on the same server. Now we can put them down in folders next to each other, and they're isolated. They won't step on each other in memory, okay? So let's back up to the 10,000-foot view. You have .NET Framework 4.6 on the left that runs WPF, Windows Forms, ASP.NET 4 and 5, as well as, and it uses that same common collection of items down there on the bottom. .NET Core right now runs ASP.NET 5 and Universal Window Apps, okay? Trying to get through these slides quickly so we can get to the cool demos. We are open sourcing all of the .NET for Core 5, okay? All of Core 5 is going to be open source. You can find it at github.com, Microsoft/.NET. There is all kinds of stuff that they're building up there. You can see how things are progressing and evolving. Fully supported and cross-platform on all three environments, okay? Very cool stuff. We do accept contributions from the community, but they need to be fully tested, vetted, and then we will fully support them. All right? And there was a question before we got started. What does this mean for Mono? We are closely working with them to make sure that we don't stomp on Mono and that they're still supported and they can work with us moving forward. So how does ASP.NET fit in? Real easy. ASP.NET 5 runs on the .NET Framework 4.6, so all the things that you've had running out there, system.web, and all the libraries that go along with that, MVC web forms, those capabilities, that stack can be used with the new ASP.NET 5 stack. Okay? And .NET Core 5, we can run on that also. So when you start up a new ASP.NET 5 project, you can target both frameworks. So I showed this in ASP.NET 5. We're open sourcing what we run on top of 4.6 and what we run on top of Core. All the runtime components, compilers, and libraries, those are still open source as well. So the stack for ASP.NET has evolved from the operating system down here. I'm going to click through this real quick. To the runtime loader, the runtime, the platform libraries, the application host, the web server, and then finally the libraries that we're going to use all the way at the top, the application you're going to build. Things have changed from the black column to the purple column. No longer just Windows, now all three. No longer running Web Engine 4 DLL to load up things for your operating system. Now we're running something called DNX, the .NET execution environment. The runtime is now not just the .NET CLR, it's the .NET Core CLR as well. Platform libraries, they're going to come to you from NuGet instead of coming down as Windows updates. The application host is DNX. It's this execution environment that you're going to use everywhere. We'll see a little bit of it today. We'll do a deep dive on that tomorrow. And the web server, we have more web servers we can use now. You're not restricted to just IIS. You can use something called Kestrel. Things are delivered with NuGet, and the application runs in Roslyn, okay? And all of these tools highlighted on the right are open source. You can get them from GitHub and work with them now, okay? You can pull down nightlies and recompile as much as you'd like. ASP's been around for more than 18 years, right? Active server pages, and then web forms ASP.NET came out in 2002. MVC, and then we built web pages in 2010. Web API and SignalR came along in 2012, and now ASP.NET 5 started, well, we announced it in 2014. So we've come a long way. We've evolved, and there aren't too many other web frameworks, server side, that have lived this long. We're kind of unique in this. In the modern web, we want ASP.NET to be totally modular, have a faster development cycle, give you the ability to choose your editor and your platform that you want to develop on. That's going to be cross-platform. So if you are a fan of VI, you can use VI. But all those fans of Emacs know that Emacs is the superior editor. So they can use Emacs also. You can use Sublime. We have plugins to make that easier for you to work with. It's completely open source. We are taking contributions. And it's fast. That's the #1 thing that we want to target is speed. We're going to be agile. We're going to have a faster development cycle. You can watch us on GitHub develop and roll these things out. More control. Because we're delivering things through NuGet, you're going to get security bugs patched by Microsoft immediately. If you need to update your system, you'll be able to do a NuGet update, and you'll get the latest updates. You don't have to wait for Patch Tuesday. All right? And everything is opt-in. Only when the developer says, yes, I want that feature, is it put down in your application and lit up on the web server. We don't have this environment where you're going to, say, file new project, and you get the kitchen sink. Right? Everything turned on, lit up. You have to opt into everything. I mentioned about runtime performance. We want very fast startup times. We want less than 2 seconds to start up. All right? The old ASP.NET would start with about a 200 meg memory footprint. We want to get down under 20. And I think we're pretty close to that right now. Development productivity, low friction. We want you to be able to type in your text editor and hit refresh on your browser and have instant updates being produced and returned to you. Seamless transition. We want to enable you to get to the cloud with your content fast and easy. All right? Configuration, session, and caching are all plugins. They're things that on Azure we can pass in updates immediately through the Azure console. The runtime is cross-platform. The editors, we support cross-platform. And we have a tool out there called OmniSharp that you can use to get this rich IntelliSense capability inside of Sublime and VI and brackets. Okay? So I want to make sure that you know how these frameworks fit together. And I put together this slide to kind of show what your choices are. So if you're using .NET Framework 4.6, you can use ASP.NET 5 because that's above it. You can use MVC and Web API 6, but you cannot, with ASP.NET 5, use web forms. Okay? Some people like that. A little bit louder so they can hear you on the recording. Come on. And there are some people who say, oh no, web forms, what are we going to do? We're still supporting web forms on ASP.NET 4.6, okay? These are side-by-side releases, right? Nothing says that you have to go to ASP.NET 5. You can use ASP.NET 4.6, and we will support it, our standard terms, for the next 10 years, okay? Now, it was, in previous announcements, it was told that we're only going to support C# on ASP.NET 5. 2 weeks ago, we announced we are bringing Visual Basic to ASP.NET 5. Do I have any VB developers in the crowd? Yes? Okay. Some people are happy about that. One person is happy about that. Visual Basic will be there. It's not going to come out with the release, but it will be there shortly after. All right? So these are the choices you have to make. And I put MVC and Web API 6 next to each other because we've merged the two. They're pretty much the same concept with controllers. You have an MVC controller and an API controller, and they're both returning content. So why do we have to make that confusing with two different controllers? We've done some things to combine those resources so that it's easier to build with and understand. Compatibility. This is the big question that people ask me. Jeff, what do I do? How do I get my stuff from MVC 5 to MVC 6? MVC 5 and all the stuff that we currently have out there, including EF6, are fully supported on the .NET Framework 4.6. But when you go to ASP.NET 5 and you want to use Core and the ASP.NET 5 frameworks, you're only using the new MVC, the new Web API, and the new EF7. Okay? There's a talk a little bit later today on EF7. This means that there will be breaking changes. There is a new project system. There is a new configuration system. There's new namespaces. There's a new HTTP context that's different and better, thinner, smaller, easier for you to use. And we also don't reference that really big system web DLL that's 14, 15 meg laying on disk, okay? Some things that you depend on in the core CLR are not yet built, okay? We're building this as fast as we can. Literally, we're building a new version of the .NET framework, the core CLR. Over the past, year or two we've been working on this, and we've got 15 years to make up on, right? So in summary, when you're looking at MVC 6, it's cloud ready on both versions of the .NET framework. It's modular, dependency injection for everything in MVC. And I'll show you a little bit of that when we get into the demos. Consistent tracing and debugging experience. But the two differentiators why you might want to choose Core 5 versus 4.6 is this side-by-side framework capability, the fast startup, low memory, and high throughput. And I should put a line on there, cross-platform. Cross-platform only happens on Core CLR 5. Okay? So, that's it for the slides. Let's start looking at some code. Okay, we're going to look at code. I got some happy. All right, so I'm now in Visual Studio 2015 RC. Now, first thing I want to make sure that you're aware of, Visual Studio is in RC, ASP.NET 5 is still in preview. Okay? We've got a couple things that we need to catch up on, and we won't be releasing a full release quality version with Visual Studio. It'll still be in beta at that time. Shortly after Visual Studio goes RTM, we will release an update that has the full RTM version of ASP.NET 5. So I can start getting involved with ASP.NET 5 by doing File, New Project. And I'm going to choose an ASP.NET Web application. Okay, just like I had before. And now I've got my same template, one ASP.NET dialog. All right, up at the top, there's my standard ASP.NET 4.6 templates. These are the ones that you've been using, that you understand, and you can keep working with. But I want to choose an ASP.NET 5 preview template, and I'm going to choose the empty one to start. Now, the empty one, quite literally, is nothing. Nothing is enabled, and it's kind of like in Node.js. When you start up a new Node.js application, all you have is a handler that you have to start wiring things up to. You don't have any frameworks loaded. You're just emitting text. You're emitting content. So with all of our ASP.NET 5 templates, you get a README page that'll give you directions to help you get started and go in the right direction. And in my project, all I have is startup page. I have this www root folder and a project.json file. Okay? The www root folder is where I'm going to put all of my static resources. These are the things that are going to be served directly over the web server. Startup CS is how I'm going to configure my pipeline of access, my pipeline of capabilities for ASP.NET. Okay? And project.json is the replacement for the old CS proj and VB proj files, right? Those ugly things that whenever you added things to and checked into source control, your team members would go, oh, no, I've got a merge problem. We've changed the model. No longer do you have to opt in and say, oh, add these files to my project. Instead, you have to say, these files aren't in my project. So if anything's in your folders, it's in the project. Okay? We'll compile it. We'll work with it. So let's take a look. By default, this is the very simple get started configuration of an empty website. App run, await context response, write async, hello world. And all that this does when I run it is emit hello world. Fine. How big's the footprint is the question? It's very small. The list of packages that are installed by default, while we're waiting for that to start. The list of packages are here in the project.json file. IIS and web listener. That's it. Okay? And for some reason, my web service isn't starting right away here. Come on. No, I don't. It's not even starting at this point. The output isn't loading. Come on. I've had a bunch of different versions of Visual Studio on here, so it's not going to be friendly to me. There we go. Okay, hello world. But because, oh, thank you. It only took how long? Look, because my startup CS, my pipeline is composed to only respond hello world, it doesn't matter where I go here. It still does hello world. Okay? because that's all that ASP.NET knows how to do. So the comparison that we like to draw is that this is very similar to how that base Node.js install works, right? Where all you've got is something that's going to spit out a series of content. When we talk about ASP.NET and the benchmarks that people run against ASP.NET prior to ASP.NET 5, it's a little bit different when you're running web forms and it's loading up modules and handlers and ASPX pages and view state, right? So many more things that we're doing to give you that rich, robust, enterprise-grade framework. You're still going to have that type of capability. It's just you now have to opt into it, just like these other frameworks do. You have to opt in and add those features. So let's start adding those features. I'm going to start off by adding an error page. Okay, let's add the ability to do an error page. So I'm going to come into Project.json, and I'm going to add the capability by adding the Microsoft Diagnostics. Microsoft ASP.NET Diagnostics. And then I'm automatically prompted with this great type ahead capability in Visual Studio to choose a version that I'd like to run. I'm going to run the beta 4 for this. Notice, and let me show you real quick, just to make sure you understand. These ones with the little folder next to it, they're versions that I have locally available to me, okay? I can use the other ones to have it go out and get the latest one from NuGet.org for me. But I'm going to choose the beta 4, and then come back over to my startup. So now while the application is running, let's throw a new exception. Whoops. Let's spell it right, too. Okay? So now I have error handling available to me. And it's this error page. It's not the yellow screen of death that we had before. But this is an error page that's being configured and delivered by the hosting provider. Okay? So now, instead of error pages and some of these other configuration things that were very low level in ASP.NET that you didn't have access to, right? You could write your own error page, your own exception page inside of ASP.NET Web Forms or MVC. But if something happened in that error page, well, you were toast at that point. You can now write that low-level error handler to catch all and output however you'd like. All right? So very extensible. Notice one thing that I did there. I didn't compile, right? I didn't compile. All I did was save and refresh. Think about it. When we compile our ASP.NET websites, right, we're gathering up all that C# or VB, compiling it together in memory, writing it to disk, starting the web server, reading it off of disk back into memory so that we can serve it to you. That's a lot of pushing and pulling of bits there, isn't it? So instead, we figured after we're done compiling it in memory, let's leave it in memory because we're just going to serve it from there. And you can actually see the compiler service here in Task Manager right there. DNX-EXE. It's sitting there compiling as I'm typing and saving and making things available for the web server to work with. Okay? So there is exception handling. We've talked about memory. Oh, and let me just show you to prove it's not on disk. This is web application. I've got a couple, just a few. So source web application, there is no bin folder, okay? There's nothing on disk for you to go to and say, ooh, there it is. Let me change that, okay? Or let me delete that. It's just not there. So let's take a look at the different frameworks. I mentioned you have different versions of the framework laying out here. I'm going to point right here. So there's two versions of the framework that we compile for while we're working with ASP.NET 5. DNX 451, That's your 4.5.1 and 4.6 versions of the framework, and DNX Core 5. And I can put configuration options in here to say, when you're in DNX Core 5, load these extra packages that are appropriate for DNX Core. And when I'm on the desktop version, the 4.6 framework, load these packages instead. Okay, I've got configuration per framework at that point. Now, let me come over and let's start another project. And this time, I'm going to do a full website. So while it's creating this, it's actually reaching out. I have NuGet packages written to disk. This is by default. We write the packages to disk for you. It's sitting in your user profile. So if I go into my user profile folder, okay, there's a .dnx. And when I look in there, I have packages. And then check out, here's all the packages needed to run the application. And then there's versions laying out here. I can drill into those. And then there's everything that was in the NuGet package and the NuGet package itself spilled out for you. Okay? So now you know where these things go on disk. Right? If there's older versions out here, you can clean them up if you're not using them anymore. All right? So that's where we're storing these things on a per user basis. Okay? So you're not constantly reaching out across the network to NuGet.org or myget.org or your own local NuGet storage to grab these content files, to grab these capabilities and add them to your application. They're already on disk for you. So now that my application is built over here, let's run this with some of the new commands that we have. So down here in Project.json, I have these 3 commands specified: web, gen, and EF. Okay? With the old entity framework, we used to have the ability to go into the PowerShell console and say, right, we'd be able to create migrations, right? And be able to do all that rich code-first capability to update our database. Well, now you do those things over here through a command line, because that's what a lot of our friends who use the other operating systems, Mac and Linux, do. They use the command line to work with their web projects. So we're going to enable those capabilities by specifying commands here. So we also have web. And what web does is it actually starts up a very small, very light web service that's built directly on top of system HTTP and allows you to debug and work with your application. So let me bring up a command prompt here. Go into this folder. This is 34. I'll go down into source. So now I'm sitting here looking at all the files that are available in my project, and I can start up that little mini web server by saying dnx.net executable dot the folder that I want to go work with, and web, because that's the name of my command. When I call that, I'm going to get the very informative started output. That's all you need to know. It's started. And then when I look over here, inside my configuration, we actually specified the URL that we're going to be listening on. So let's grab that and navigate to it. And I'm on 35. It's going to answer the same one. Thank you. I'm batting 1,000 here with this. So while that's starting up, this is what we mean. This is running with the .NET Core. This is running as base and as low level as you can get. We don't have all those enterprise features on top of this, like SSL and caching, okay? We just have Jeff's machine running really slow at the moment. Is there a way to specify a web config? So let me touch on configuration. There we go, finally. We don't have web config in the new world, okay? Instead, we have a config.json. I'll show you that in a second. So this is the default application that we get when we start up and we say new website, okay? It's this very bootstrap-aware, responsive website that you're used to seeing if you've done some of the latest ASP.NET development, okay? I've got the ability to come in and take a look at some of these other pages. I've even got login capabilities. There we go. There's ways that we've already got configured so that you can add other third-party services to authenticate with ASP.NET 5 and start working with that security instead if you want to log in with Facebook, Twitter, or the Microsoft account. Those types of authentication capabilities are out there. They're actually commented out sitting in the code. What about local Active Directory? I believe we have support for Active Directory. There is an Active Directory plugin that you can use. I'm getting confirmation from one of my colleagues here in the front row. It's just another package you have to add in and turn on. So here's where... No, we now have local available. So let's take a quick look at how this pipeline is set up so that it's got all those full features, and I'll take a look at the configuration as well. There's an initial startup that's called, and it goes and grabs the configuration out of config.json. So we still have this configuration file laying out here that you can work with and you can put entries into, okay? And it's a lot simpler than the old web config with angle brackets all over the place and you had to configure things appropriately. Web config is still available, and that's being used only for configuring IIS. For configuring ASP.NET, we're going to go through Project.json or Config.json. Project.json to help configure your server-side resources, Config.json for those configuration capabilities that you want for your application. Yes, sir. Question over here. Do we still have transforms? We don't have transforms anymore because we want to push you in the direction of using environment variables or configuration that will be pushed in from Azure when you promote things up into the cloud. So if you look, let me go back to startup. After we add that config.json, we're also going to reach out, and if there's a different environment config.json you want, we'll grab that value and pass it in using this Roslyn formatted string, okay? Are you guys familiar? Have you seen that dollar quote syntax before with Roslyn? We're interpreting that, and we're saying execute and look at the format of this. The things that are in curly braces, that's C#. So we're going to reach into the env object, grab the environment name, and drop it there. It makes text formatting look and read a little bit easier. So the line item there on 42, to you, sir, your question, we're going to add environment variables at that point, and then you can query them. And since the environment variables are added later in the pipeline, if you have something sitting in config.json, you can overwrite it with an environment variable. So things like connection string or your Azure storage account keys that you might have had in your config.json or in your app settings inside a web config, store that in an environment variable on Azure, and it'll overlay that appropriately for you. Good question, thank you. So configuration is a little bit more complex, but it gives you a lot of power. Question over here, yes, sir.
So when you keep adding more JSON files, it kind of pushes it all into one big configuration, and it's as if you externalize them.
So the question is, as you add more of these configuration JSON files, it kind of pushes them all together. Yes, last one in wins. The last configuration option that's added, excuse me, is the one that wins, is the one that will be available to you.
So it's kind of like a big, kind of add all JSON objects into one big object.
The question is it one big JSON object that it delivers? It's one object in memory that you'll be able to query, this configuration object. And in fact, with this template, let me show you, If I look in the views and I look at shared, the layout, see this here, at inject up top? Everything in ASP.NET MVC has dependency injection turned on by default. How cool is that? So you don't have to go reaching all over the place and figure out where is this service available and whatever. It's just injected into your views, your controllers, if you just ask for it. So in this case, we're asking for the options app settings, and that will be made available to you. The options app settings are a piece of configuration that is being loaded. There it is, services configure, app settings. It's getting the subkey of app settings from configuration, and that happens to be right here. So I have an app setting sitting in config.json that is being lifted and injected into my view as a collection. And right here, I can say app settings options, so it's getting that collection of settings that was made available to me. Site title, which is just the text that was laid down in config.json. So you see how that dependency injection, it comes across to me. No longer do I have to go configuration manager.app settings, square bracket, no. And it's strongly typed C#. Okay? So now we're pushing around configuration a little bit with this dependency injection. But the next thing I want to show you while we're looking at the view here is we've got these tags in purple. And those aren't standard HTML tags. Did Microsoft invent something new to add on to HTML5? No. Listen, if there's one thing that I want to make sure you get out of this before I start talking about these tags, it's that we at Microsoft want to play well with the internet, okay? The rest of the internet developers that are using PHP, Ruby, Java, Node.js, there's ways and techniques that they use to work with things that we've added into our capabilities here. We are not going to invent some new HTML standard so that as ASP.NET developers you can work with this. These are called tag helpers, okay? These are ways that you can abstract the generation of tags of HTML and other content that you want to ship over the wire and drop them into your page. So we've written this environment tag helper, which you can equate a little bit to something like a web control, except it only sees what's inside of its tags. And here I'm saying, if the environment is development, emit these link tags. However, if the environment name is staging or production, we're going to go emit these link tags. Now notice the link tags on lines 10, 11, and 12, well, they're standard, right? They're the standard red text, but the ones on 15 and 18, those are purple. They're purple because we've added in these extra attributes, these ASP fallback attributes. And what these are doing is they give us the ability to say, go reach across the CDN and grab this version of this content. However, if you can't find it and test with this capability, then use this version of the file. Make sense? So that's kind of a neat way for us to deliver and have C#, our server-side processing, parse and work with our HTML to deliver a better experience. And it also makes us a little bit more productive, too. I don't have to write all this JavaScript to do the testing and getting things over the CDN and emitting those links appropriately. Now, I have another project out here that I want to load that shows, down here, that shows how to write a couple of tag helpers. So this is, there we go. This is a tag helper sample that I wrote that allows us to emit thumbnail capabilities using the Bootstrap framework. Okay? So the thumbnail tags are in purple because I've said we're going to use tag helpers from the tag helper sample helpers assembly, which is included in my solution here. And I've written thumbnail tag helper. The tag helper is a simple C# class that descends from tag helper. I can specify the target element tag name that I want to work with, if there's any attributes that are required in order to use this. And then I have a process method. There's also a process async method you can use that will define, here's how I want to format my text, my HTML content in this case. All right? So here we are again. We've got a way to abstract and make delivering this content easier and faster for you. You don't have to write all the jQuery and JavaScript that goes with these things. Okay? The markup will be generated and just be available to work. All right? So let me go back to my other sample. And we're good on time. Good. So what I want to show you now is, I mentioned earlier that the controllers, the controllers are kind of the same between Web API and MVC. Okay? Here we are. I've got my home controller. This is the default controller that's generated for me, and it descends from controller. It's not MVC controller. It's not API controller. It's just controller. And I'm returning iAction results, right? Very similar to what I would do with normal MVC5 and earlier. When we start talking about how Web API works with this, I can add another controller here. And I'm just going to say, let me grab one of these. And I've got an Ignite controller. And right now, all it has is index. But I can take this, and if I say public string get, all right, and let's rerun this. So now let me go to /ignite. I didn't define a route. Okay. So I've got Web API-like capabilities right there without adding too much into this. Maybe I want to have that answer on /API/ignite. Right? I just change my route, and it won't answer on that, but it will go when I go to API Ignite. So now I can compartmentalize and place these things where I need to, and I haven't changed much of my source code. I'm still working in that same model with my controllers. I don't need to know the difference between the API controller and the standard controller, the standard MVC controller. In fact, I don't even need to tell it that it's a controller. Because you use the naming convention of something controller, we'll use that POCO, that plain old class object, as a MVC Web API controller. Okay? Cool. And it still works returning content if I have, returning content in the other formats that I might need, right? So if I say IEnumerable string, and I return new string, Ignite 2015, right? So this is JSON that it's returning, okay? I haven't changed anything, and it still works, all right? We're making this flexible and easier to use. If I request and I say, give me XML, just like in Web API previously, it'll return XML format. So that's nice and all that. Now, what about some of the things that we saw in the command line? And how do we start using that in other environments? I mentioned this DNX thing. There's also something out there called DNVM. Okay? Now, when I use DNVM, it gives me the capabilities to set up the .NET versions that are on that are available on my machine. Okay, this is where things get started. So I can start setting up the various versions. I can look at my list of versions that are available here. And you can see I've got a bunch of them that I've installed, and I can pivot back and forth between those if I want to try out new versions because there's new features available. I don't have to go and reinstall a bunch of things. I can easily change my version by saying dnvm use and that version name. Now, what happens when we start going over to Linux? Because that's one of the big things that we've been touting, is that we can go and work over there. So I've got a VM here running Ubuntu, and that's the way you say it, is what I'm told. It's not Ubuntu, it's Ubuntu. There we go. And in this environment, things are really, really small. Come on now. I'm trying to get my zoom tool to work here. There we go. I've got Visual Studio Code running inside of Linux, okay? And this is something that Linux administrators should be fairly comfortable with downloading, unzipping, and making available to you. But this is available for all three environments, Mac, Linux, and Windows. So I have this running out here, and I'm just pointed to a folder that has all of my stuff to run my application. And if I run dnx kestrel, Kestrel is another web server that we've written that runs cross-platform and runs on top of that node runtime, the libuv runtime. You can see I get the very helpful started message down on the bottom of my terminal there. And when I go and browse to it at localhost 5001, I'll get my website. And it's the same content that I had before running on Windows. Cool, right? Now my web developers can be productive on Linux. They compile and run on Linux. They compile and run on Mac, and it will run over there. I can compile well, I can take that code, and when I need to deploy it to Windows, recompile and deploy it to Windows. But my designers and those creatives that want to work on those other environments can, and we can start to collaborate. Yes, a question here in the row.
So it needs to be recompiled for each platform. It doesn't run on the common runtime environment.
So the question is, it needs to be recompiled for each environment. So we need to make sure when that DNX runs, we need to make sure that it compiles and delivers the native libraries that it connects to appropriate for each environment. So when I do my publish and I want to publish for a different environment, I need to make sure that I'm publishing with those native libraries. Good question, right? I'm right on there. Yeah. Another question? Where?
Right here.
Cool. Yes.
Can you explain like any similar differences between the DNX process and your work in normal ASP.NET?
So the question is, can we discuss some of the differences in process when I'm using DNX versus just working in Visual Studio?
Well, no, just the actual DNX, like EXE that's running in Task Manager versus like the W3 worker.
So, okay, you're asking for the difference between DNX, EXE versus W3, WP.
Like specifically, like does the DNX spin up for each individual web server that you're running, or each individual environment? How does that work?
So to make sure everybody hears, including the recording, does a copy of DNX start up for each service that's running? Now, in the .NET Core world, I believe it does, because we're going to run those side by side with different versions, okay? But they're going to be a lot smaller than having that big W3WP that's loading the entire base class library for you because it needs system web and all those features to run on IIS. Now, when you do run on IIS, we put something called Helios in between, and that's a shim that knows how to talk to IIS and deliver content from DNX. Okay? All right? So, hey, I got that one right. So does that make sense? I mean, we're giving you this ability to swap out web servers without changing your code, right? When you look over here at how I was running the application, we're putting down the information to connect to IIS, and we're putting down the information to connect and use that lightweight web listener with DNX. So I can change those without changing any of my code, all right? I don't need to do anything differently because I'm hosted in a different environment. Yes, a question here in the second row.
Going back to the configs, we encrypt most of our connection string configurations. How does that work with using environmental variables and JSON?
The question is that in this gentleman's organization, they encrypt their connection strings. How do we use that with environment variables in this new environment? So when you encrypt those variables and things, they are being de-encrypted. They are being put into memory at the point that they're being used. If you only set that environment variable when you get to the cloud that has that production setting, it's then secured to that user's profile. So it will be encrypted at rest in the registry, I believe, then. Let me follow up on that. Drop me a line on Twitter, C#Fritz. Yes, a question over here, sir. I'm sorry? The app pool. How does the app pool in IIS work? That's the question. It still works the same. It's just instead of calling into W3WP to manage the web pool, it's going to work with DNX instead. It's close to what exactly it does. Close enough for now. We're still working on that kind of thing. A lot of this is still in motion, okay? Let me make sure that you see the couple things that we have out on GitHub first. Yes, Linux, keep going. So all of the source code that we're working on is out here at ASP.NET Home, and this is where we're doing support as well. But all the instructions for how to get started with these tools are out here on GitHub, okay? Now, even cooler than just the tools being available out here on GitHub, the docs. Come on. Are available at docs ASP.NET, and using this tool from readthedocs.com, our friends over there that publish with the Sphinx capabilities, we have all of our documentation here, and it's open source as well. Check it out. I can go into one of these articles, read through it all, and at the bottom, I have the ability to submit a pull request. Okay? And I can output in PDF, HTML, and EPUB format because you want to read these docs on your Kindle. All right? This is growing. This is something that we're working on, and it's something that you, if you're so interested, can contribute to. If there's something you experience and you want to write up, you can do that. So we're trying to really make this as transparent as possible for everyone. So I've gone through, I've shown Project.json, I've shown how to work with configuration. Let me show you some of the things on the front end that we're doing to be better internet citizens, do the things that the other web frameworks do. And before, we had a lot of capabilities around compression and minification, right? You had to use these different tools to cache and compile and minify your JavaScript or CSS content. Well, that's not how the rest of the web does this. They have libraries laying out there in a service called Bower, right? Bower is another package manager that was written by our friends at Twitter that will allow you to deliver and fetch and work with these static component libraries like Bootstrap, jQuery. And what's important to know about Bower compared to NuGet, right? NuGet is something that Microsoft started up and we manage, and it's open source, but it primarily delivers a lot of binaries, okay? So when people like jQuery go and publish a new version, well, who do you think puts the jQuery package into NuGet? It's somebody on our team, okay? So whenever there's a new version of jQuery or Angular, an hour or two later, there's a message that goes out on Twitter, oh, why doesn't NuGet have the latest Angular? It's like, come on. So what Bower does is Bower is actually built on top of Git, right? The source control tool. So when people register their packages with Git, unlike NuGet where there's actual binaries and content uploaded and stored in a repository somewhere, with Bower, all they store is a pointer to the Git repository. So when you go to Bower and say, hey, give me a copy of jQuery, it actually reaches into jQuery's Git repository where they've been building things and gives you that version that jQuery has tagged. That's really cool because then as soon as jQuery or Angular releases something, it's instantly available to everybody. Now that might be a good thing or a bad thing if they go and release something and say, oops, we made a mistake. It's already published and available. But that's the way they do things. So we're enabling you to use Bower inside of your projects by default here. So I can come through and using some of the tooling that we've built, I've now got IntelliSense on Bower packages. So I can go and start adding jQuery, and there's my jQuery UI items that I can add to my project. So let me add jQuery UI. And it's going to go and determine, here's the versions that are available to me. All right? So let me add that 1.11.4. Save. Now, when that's been collected and delivered, it actually makes that available here in my dependencies list. There it is right there. Okay? So now I have in my solution, I've got my two frameworks as references. Those are my server-side binary references. And then I've got these dependencies from Bower and NPM for client-side work. All right? And they're all listed out there, and I can start to work with them there. On disk, let me show you where these land on disk, and then show you how we're actually going to work with these. So my Bower components are downloaded, and inside of my web application folder, they're put in this Bower components folder. Similarly, my node modules that I download, these are different node utilities, executables that you can use to work with your project, are dropped in this node modules folder. So what we want to do is we want to put static files in this root folder. But I've got my Bower components coming down and landing in this Bower components folder. So how do we cross the streams, as it were? How do we get it moved over there? Well, we're now recommending people use Gulp. Anybody familiar with Gulp? Maybe a third, 25% of the room. How about Grunt? About the same number of people. These are task managers that the Node community uses that are written in JavaScript, that are very portable, that will run on Windows, Mac, and Linux to optimize, run tasks, things that you're going to do again and again and again. All right? Things like go get copies of these libraries, copy them down, put them in the appropriate location for you. And this was a big problem that we had with NuGet, where there was content that you would download. You'd download that jQuery NuGet package, and it would drop things into the scripts folder. But maybe in your project, your folder is JS, where you want your JavaScript files. Or maybe lib. Well, you can't do that redirect with NuGet, at least not easily. So using Gulp here, we have this task that we've written, copy, that will, for these Bower packages, place these files into these folders. So for the jQuery package, it will put things into the jQuery folder. Not bad. And if we look inside of root, inside of lib, there's jQuery. Okay? So these things are being copied and moved around, and they'll be updated for you as they change, and you rerun these tasks. So now the question is, well, how do I run these tasks? This isn't something that when I hit F5, I expect the compiler to run and deliver to me ASP.NET goodness. How do I run this thing? We've added this thing called the Task Runner Explorer. Here. Oops. Let me bring that back up. There it is. All right. So here's the tasks that are defined in my gulp file, clean and copy. And I can take these tasks and I can connect them to events inside of Visual Studio so that while I'm working with my project, these are called appropriately. So if I right-click, I can say binding and have it run before I build, after the build occurs, when I do a clean on my project, or when the project is opened. Or I can even run stuff now. So if I say run now, it goes and it's going to call clean because that's a dependent task, and then it runs copy, and it's done. But it'll run that. Let's turn that on and say before build. Okay? So now if I do a Control-Shift-B, it actually runs that in the background for me down here. All right? So now I've got JavaScript automation happening. Come on, go away. I've got JavaScript automation happening to start putting some of these static resources together for me so that I can work in that very HTML UI-friendly, JavaScript developer-centric front-end world. And I can also do the great server-side things with C# that I'm familiar with. Let me show you a little bit of VS Code while I have you here. So this is the new Visual Studio Code Editor that we released at Build last week. Now, we're showing this in preview mode now, okay? Once again, we're getting you in early, making you aware of what types of things we're planning and working on. And just like you saw in Linux, I've got this same UI. I've got my list of files down the side. I can go and reach into a Git repository if this is stored in Git, and I can see how that works. Okay? I can search through my files if I need to. And I've got great IntelliSense capabilities in here. All right, let me zoom in. Right, so if I come over here and say var s equals hello ignite, when I say s dot, now instead of having just things that are available to me that it had seen about other types, it's actually doing rich IntelliSense here, and I can do things like to lower, and it knows that this is a string. Okay, it's interpreted that and delivered this content. It delivered this IntelliSense content. Similarly, if I change that to 1, now I don't have that string capability. It doesn't know about all those things. And if you look down on the bottom here, see the little flame? This is OmniSharp, this little flame, this indicator down here. This is a service that's running in the background that's actually parsing through my C# using the Roslyn compiler and figuring out what things are available to me for the various code that I write. Cool, right? I mean, now I've got this portability that I can work with a C# compiler and get the IntelliSense, get some of the other rich editor features in other places. And to be clear, we call this Visual Studio Code because it's a code editor. It's not so much an IDE, okay? We're going to add some IDE-like features. We're going to continue to build this out, but it's a text and code editor first so that you get the rich, fast text editing experience with it, okay? So, let's come back, and I want to look back at, I've shown you the open source projects. Oh, let me show you where OmniSharp is online. That's important. And these are things, it's COM, isn't it? Really? Where did they hide it on us? Net. That's why. So this is open source. This is a community effort. Microsoft isn't writing this, okay? This is a bunch of guys who are saying, hey, we want to enable VI. We want to enable Sublime to have great ASP.NET editing capabilities, and it works. So we're using that in our Visual Studio Code tool so that you get that good experience that everybody's going to get, whether they're in Sublime or whatever, right? So let me bring up, I thought I had Sublime here, don't I? I don't. I don't have Sublime on this machine. Let's take a look at, what else do I want to show? So I've shown you docs, dependency injection. Let me make sure I hit that hard. So I showed you briefly that there's this @inject capability up here inside of my Razor to add things in, right? I'm not limited to just having a model that I'm passing into my Razor. As I declare and say, I want this capability inside of my controller, it'll inject and make that available to me, right? So if I say public home controller, and I ask for, is it ilog? What's the log? It's, the logger is sitting, here it is, ilogger factory. So I believe it's ilogger. Come on. That one. It'll make this logger available to me, right? Log information, and I can say home controller called. And that'll dump it into, I believe that dumps into my debug console. Now, I started this with debug attached. That rich ability to do save and restart automatically of my C# code, that doesn't work while you have the, oh no. Shouldn't I get a logger with that, Glenn? I thought it was. Let's take a look. Logger factory add console. Right? So I should be able to log to the console with that. It was home controller. I'm blanking here. All right. I'll blog about that a little bit later, because it's not working the way I thought it would. Look, there's a lot that's going on here. I want you to be able to get started today. Go to visualstudio.com, get a copy of Visual Studio RC, and check it out. It will run side by side with Visual Studio 2013, 2012, 2010. You won't have a problem with that conflicting. Make sure you go to msdnmicrosoft.com and you see what we're talking about these things, okay? There's a lot happening around this technology. It's an exciting time to be a .NET developer. Look, my father was a Unix admin for decades. Before that, he programmed in BASIC. And when I told him that we're bringing VB cross-platform with ASP.NET, he almost fell out of his chair. This isn't something that Microsoft would do, but we are, okay? We want to play with all the children the same, okay? Now, I want to make sure you know, if you go to ASP.NET, let me make sure you're aware, we have a weekly TV show that we do called the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. If you go to, that's not it. If you go to asp.net/vnext, there's links down the right side here for information about our community stand-up that we do each week. Now, this isn't, hey, you know, what did so-and-so talk about out in the community on their blog? Or what's the presentation that this person gave about ASP.NET? This is, what features did we build this week? And you'll see us talk about and discuss those features. This is your opportunity to almost call in to the talk show and say, hey, we like that. Or ask questions about, well, why does this function this way? I'd like it to behave differently. and the people who write it will respond to you. Okay? Now, another resource that you have available to you here at Ignite is up at the Microsoft Web Development booth on the conference floor. We brought along 2 rockstar ninja developers who build this stuff. All right? Taylor and Andrew. And they're going to answer your questions if you want to know more about the nitty-gritty, the low-level, how this stuff works, because they're building it every day. Okay? So after this session, later on, after lunch, I'll be up there. Some of the other guys will be up there. You can ask us all the questions you'd like about this, and we'll be happy to help you out because we want to make sure you're successful with ASP.NET 5. I think I've got one more slide here because we need to show, yes, free upgrade to Visual Studio. There it is. Visual Studio Enterprise with MSDN. So it's no longer Visual Studio Ultimate, it's Visual Studio Enterprise. More information about this offer. I'm sure you guys have seen this slide in other sessions. And of course a QR code, because no session is complete without a QR code. The video, the slides from this will be available tomorrow on Channel 9 if you want to see some of my demos again, if you want to review what happened, or you want to take a look at the slides. Thank you very much for coming out.